Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world, and welcome to episode 26 of the ESG Show. And of course, Happy New Year to everybody watching today's episode, and indeed anybody who's not watching this episode for that matter. Today, we are talking about practical steps an organization can take to become more sustainable. Before we get into that, I want to talk to you about some news that's broken in the last few days. There's some very worrying news, and I think there's some very encouraging news. And as I'm sure most people watching this will know, according to Copernicus, the European Union's Earth Observation Programme, 2023 saw the highest temperatures ever recorded worldwide. The Copernicus study stated, if you just excuse me whilst the computer catches up with me, the Copernicus study stated that I'll read it to you anyway. 2023 is confirmed as the warmest calendar year in global temperature data records going back to 1850. 2023 had a global average temperature of 14.98 degrees, which is 0.10 degrees higher than the previous highest annual average set in 2016. 2023 was 0.6 degrees warmer than the 1991 to 2020 average, and more to the point, was 1.48 degrees warmer than the 18 to 50 1900 pre-industrial level. The report says it is likely that a 12-month period ending in January or February this year will exceed 1.5 degrees above the industrial level. The report goes on to say that 2023 marks the first time on record that every day within a year has exceeded 1 degree above the 1850 to 1900 pre-industrial level. And close to 50% of days were more than 1.5 degrees warmer than the 18 to 50 1900 level. And 2 days in November were for the first time more than 2 degrees warmer. Annual average air temperatures were the warmest on record, or close to the warmest, over sizable parts of all ocean basins and all continents except Australia. The report says December 2023 was the warmest December on record globally, with an average temperature of 13.51 degrees centigrade, 0.85 above the 1991 to 2020 average, and 1.78 degrees above the 1850-1900 level. Global average sea surface temperatures remain persistently and unusually high, reaching record levels for the first time of the year from April through to December. And finally, 2023, of course, saw a transition to El Nino in the spring, as La Nina came to an end. So that was the bad news, and it is indeed worrying news. But we've also got some encouraging news as well, and according to a report. And let's start with a report from Carbon Brief. According to this report, the amount of UK electricity generated from fossil fuels fell 22% year on year in 2023 to the lowest level since 1957. That was the lowest level since Harold Macmillan was Prime Minister, and when I believe the Beatles had only just met for the first time. 104 terawatts were generated from fossil fuels in 2023, which is the lowest level in 66 years. But, and I think this is the important thing, part of the fall was due to an increase in demand, but there was also a massive increase in supply from renewables as well. Some 113 terawatt hours of additional supply from renewables, which was greater than the fall in demand. But it's not just a Carbon Brief story as well. It's not just a UK related story. There's also issues worldwide. Professor Mark Jacobson from Harvard University looked at the amount of energy generated throughout the world. And in South Dakota, for example, I think it was something like 99% or 97% of all electricity generated was from wind, solar, or other renewable sources. So that is all rather encouraging. And there's also good news from China as well. Again, an article according to Carbon Brief, China's emissions are set to fall in 2024. And I believe that's the first time they will have fallen for a very long time. So that's good news. But let me tell you before we go any further about a survey that we have produced. And you must forgive me because I was hoping that the survey would appear on the screen, but alas, it hasn't. So I'm going to pull it up from my computer. So if you could just bear with me whilst I attempt to do that. Well, maybe I won't attempt to do that. It seems to have disappeared from my computer. So you're just going to have to take my word for it. So we did a survey. We did a survey in which we asked the question, why are businesses not taking action to become more sustainable? And of the replies that we had, 18% fixed or resistance to change was the reason why businesses were not taking action to become more sustainable. 23% cited lack of awareness or authenticity. 27% said cost concerns, and 32% talked about complexity and limited resources. We had one comment from that, Sanjay Sebastian. He said, all these reasons are interconnected. However, the most significant factor could be cost concerns. The perceived high upfront costs associated with adopting sustainable practices or technologies can be a substantial barrier for businesses, especially if they are focused on short-term financial goals. Anyhow, I think we should proceed and meet today's guests. And on the show today, we have Matthew Hampshire War. Hello, Matthew. How are you today?
Hello.
You're a bit echoey. Can you have another go at speaking? Matthew? Matthew seems to have frozen. What I'll do is I'll move on to our next guest and come back to Matthew shortly. Also on the show today, we have Ram. Hello, Ram. How are you today?
Hi, Michael. I'm doing very well. How about yourself?
Yes, brilliant. Thank you. So, Ram Chaitanya. Have I pronounced your name correctly, Ram?
Yeah, that's correct.
Good. He's the founder of EcoWiser, a web platform focused on educated consumers to make more sustainable choices and working with brands to communicate their sustainability practices in a third-party, verified, credible manner. Prior to EcoWiser, Ram worked on Google and Danaher in different roles across the globe, and he holds an MBA from INSEAD. So Ram, can you tell me a little bit about what EcoWiser does?
So at EcoWiser, we're primarily focused on making it easy for the consumers to live more sustainably by providing alternatives that are eco-friendly. And we also directly work with brands to help improve their sustainability practices and communicate their sustainability marketing efforts in a third-party verified, credible manner.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, I got you on the show. Today's theme is practical steps an organization can take to become more sustainable. Do you have any, can you think of any examples of that?
I can highlight one thing. We primarily work heavily with consumer-focused brands. So I'll highlight one thing that brands can do is, let's say you're a fashion or a food or a skincare brand. Look at what are the different certifications that are there in your space, and also understand which of these certifications consumers are more aware of, and see if you can adopt any of those certifications, because that will help build trust. Also, going back to what Michael just shared a couple of minutes before, right? this cost barriers are one of the biggest barriers why people don't adopt sustainability. So, like using trusted certifications is one effective way of actually making building trust with your consumers and more consumers potentially buying from you.
Okay, thank you for that, Ram. Matthew, are you? Can you?
I
Can you
think
hear
I'm
me?
back. Yeah, sorry, I got thrown out the room there.
That's no problem. We couldn't hear you for some reason. I don't know why. But anyway, this is Matthew, Dr. Matthew Hampshire War. How are you today?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me on the show. Excited to be involved.
That is our pleasure entirely. So, Matthew, Dr. Matthew Hampshire War is a former director at the Global Investment Bank, where his work focused on renewables, electric cars, batteries, and biofuels. His first best-selling book, Climate Change and the Road to Net Zero, is a non-fiction analysis of the science, technology, economics, and politics of climate change and the low carbon transition. Matthew is also Matthew, whilst he believes much of the transition will be driven by emerging technology, reaching net zero food and agriculture rely more heavily on cultural change. Matthew started thinking, is it possible to continue to celebrate and enjoy the world's favourite recipes whilst also protecting the planet? This question became the inspiration for his latest book, The Climate Change Kitchen. The idea to combine his experience in chemistry and finance with a love of cooking, to crunch the numbers, carbon hack classic recipes, and reimagine the world's favourite dishes for a low carbon future. So, Matthew, tell me about some of these dishes for a low carbon future, and tell me about what your book's about.
Yeah, no problem. And thanks for that introduction. And yeah, as you mentioned, it all started with my first book, which was called Climate Change and the Road to Net Zero. And that was really a sort of no nonsense, agnostic look at the problem and possible solutions to climate change. And the book was really trying to answer the questions, how big a problem is climate change? Is it a problem which can be solved? If so, how do we solve it? And is it worth solving? How much is it going to cost? And you've already spoken about the costs of climate action today. And in writing that book, it took me 2 years to put together and piece together. It really showed me that we have the solutions to most of the problems in technologies. You've already mentioned renewables, batteries, electric cars, electrical heating solutions. And these solutions, if you look at the cost progression, they're actually becoming so cheap now that if you project out a net zero system in the future, it's actually not only going to be better for the planet and solve climate change, but it's actually going to be better for the consumer's pocket as well. It's going to be cheaper. But coming out of writing that book, the kind of one area or the one caveat I had was within agriculture. So it's a quarter of all global CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions. But decarbonizing the food that we eat every day is going to rely a lot more heavily on cultural change, or changing our habits, rather than just deploying technology, which is a solution for a lot of the other areas of the economy. And that's because agricultural emissions are linked to land use and the rearing of animals. So, as you said, my latest book is a bit of fun, but it's also it's a serious topic, and it's a way of creating small changes that have a very big impact, and that's changing the way we eat. So I wanted to see if I could take the world's most popular dishes to make them low carbon, still just as tasty, and still meat-based, because I get that not everybody wants to be vegetarian or vegan. And I started with an understanding which I got from my first book, which is sort of maybe contrary to popular belief. Things like food miles, packaging, cooking techniques, add all of these up, they're only responsible for about a third of the carbon footprint of food. And actually, the other 2/3 is the ingredient choice, basically. So the premise of the book is that I put together a simple set of rules or ingredient swaps, if you like, which on average reduce the carbon footprint of the dishes you're cooking by 75%. And as a bonus, they also reduce the calories by 20% and the saturated fat by an average of 40%. So they're all good for you and good for the planet. I guess that's the whole premise behind the book.
Okay, that's great. So does that mean I can have steak and chips without burning too much carbon fossil fuels?
You can't.
So
we could maybe touch on the rules a little bit later, but if I had to give you a very high level set of rules for low carbon cooking, they are as follows: more vegetables, less meat, which I think is a fairly well known view. What's maybe less well known is that you should be eating chicken and pork instead of beef and lamb. Because rearing cows and sheep takes lots of land. And if you need lots of land, you've got to cut down lots of trees, which releases lots of CO2. Cows and sheep also emit methane directly, which is a potent greenhouse gas. It's 30 times more warming than CO2. And actually, this is from burps. And this is sizable. So cow and sheep burps account for nearly 5% of all emissions in the world. So that's nearly as much as deforestation. So more chicken and pork, less beef and lamb. If we're talking fish, you want to eat more things like mollusks, so mussels, clams, scallops, and less crustaceans such as prawn, crab, or lobster, because mollusks can actually be farmed off the coastline where they filter and clean the water, and they're very low carbon. There's no destruction of the seabed in harvesting them. And apart from that, it's things like less dairy. Again, dairy comes from cows. More plant-based alternatives. Opt for soft cheeses, which use less milk than hard cheeses. Go easy on the oil, because remember, cooking oil is concentrated plant matter, just the same as the oil that you put in your car. And of course, minimize waste, because if you're wasting all of this stuff, then it's unnecessary emissions and unnecessary cost. So those are very high level sort of 7 rules that I deploy in the book, which are really simple, and you can take them into cooking at home, other dishes, in what you select to eat from a restaurant, in what your weekly shop is about. So hopefully I'm just kind of trying to demystify the world of sort of low carbon footprint cooking, if you like.
Okay, we've had a question. Faisal Anwar, what about rice, for example? It is quite water intensive, he says.
Yes, rice is water intensive. Also, there's a process called rice paddy dry down, which I think in between harvests, they have to dry off the rice paddies. And in doing so, you actually release and oxidize a lot of the carbon from the soil is lost to the atmosphere. That accounts for something like 3% of global CO2 emissions. So rice is a little bit worse than other staples. But it's still a lot better than meat, let's say. So let me give you a very rough idea of this. Take an average vegetable will emit about 1 kilogram of CO2 per kilogram of vegetable. Chicken and pork, you're talking 3 to 7 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of meat. Lamb and beef, you're talking 25 to 75 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of meat.
All right. Okay. So it's a huge difference.
So there's big differences. Some things are better than others within vegetables, but there's a massive shift once you get to things like beef and lamb.
I understand. All right. Well, thank you for that, Matthew. And Matthew will be joining us again shortly. But for the time being, it's time to meet our next guest, who is Ritik. Hello, Ritik. How are you?
I'm doing well, very well. Good to see you again, Michael, and good to be back in the show. And very happy New Year from Brighton today for a change.
Well, good to have you. Ritik was a guest on the very first episode of the ESG show, so it's nice to have you back on episode 26. And Ritik comes from my hometown of Brighton as well, so that's that
special connection.
A special connection. A special connection. A town that's boasting a football team that's doing rather well at the moment as well, I would add. So Ritik has over 25 years of experience in sustainably transitioning processes, businesses, communities, and careers across hospitality, servicing, finances, and consulting, while living and working in Asia, Americas, and Europe. Ritik currently runs a consultancy firm supporting companies, communities, and individuals with ESG transitions. And Ritik, I gather you have had some rather exciting news today.
Yes, it came in this morning. So we're part of the in a Small Business Britain, which if you've not heard of it, and it's very good for like small business and also enabling you towards green skills. So we've been invited to the House of Lords on the February the 7th. Obviously, not hoping it's not for a speech, but it's an audience, and it's just shows that there's interest and sponsorship towards going green, and also for small businesses. So yeah, looking forward to it. Excited.
Okay, thanks for that, Ritik. And so, what's the name of your consultancy firm, and what do you do?
Yes, so Dukes for You Limited, which is the name of the firm, has got 3 different areas that we focus on. So it's the product side of it is called the Green Footprint Shop, which focuses on replacing plastic in daily use and also sustainable gift options. The consulting side of it goes in the name of Sable, which is also about developing an app which is going to be more real-time and advisory in nature for businesses to understand where they stand in terms of their carbon footprint, but also to take those appropriate steps to take it forward. And we're working on a third project, which is going to be still pretty much under Dukes for You Limited, which is to be supporting and enabling communities and empowering them to be transitioning towards more sustainable futures. This is going to be more of a pro bono. It's something much more for the community, giving back kind of thing.
Okay, now at the beginning of this show, I was talking about the good news about the number of renewables, about the fossil fuel emissions in the UK is its lowest level since 1957 or 58. But I think you're telling me this morning that there's a catch.
Yes, there is a catch. I think a few factors need to be, or I would say some of these important facts needs to be factored in. First of all, we've got to look at where the alternate fuel is coming from. And also in terms of, recently, whatever is happening on the political scenario has led to the cost that small businesses particularly has incurred in terms of the energy costs. And that energy has not been easily available. So it's more of a supply thing, which now helps us to focus on renewables. And it has happened in history in the past that, there have been major events which has triggered a consumption behavioral change. But it's come at a lot of cost, Michael. If you walk around the streets of where you and I, we live and go further up north, there are lots of businesses which are shutting shop, primarily because of energy reasons. And so that cost has to be embedded in, whilst we celebrate, some of the successes of more usage of renewable energy. And I have known businesses which are struggling with it, but yet just keeping up with it, in the hope of a better future. So kudos to them.
Okay, all right. But I mean, the supply of energy from renewables has also increased enormously as well. So there is a good side to it as well, I think.
Yes. I think it's just one more thing I missed out. I think we need to also understand where electricity is generated and how is it generated. So whilst the cars that are running our streets, might be on electric and it's not emitting the fume, but where is this electricity generated? Also, I think a big topic right now is where are these going to be charged, and how is this infrastructure suddenly going to change basis, how it all changed to something that we knew was not the right thing, which was the oil engines and the motors. Now we're also up against a big lobby. I think perhaps one of the biggest lobbies that politics and power coincides with, which is the oil lobby. We'd have to see how that works out, because a development in the West, alone, is not going to be the answer for something which is truly a global problem.
Indeed, I think that is definitely the case. So can you tell us, Ritik, practical steps an organisation can take to become more sustainable? Can you think of an example?
Yes, it's experiential that, every time, I've had conversations with small business owners, they are, as I mentioned earlier, struggling with the situation in terms of cost. I think Ram mentioned that earlier as well, and this is something that Matthew mentioned briefly. Cost is a huge issue, and one thing that I have seen people succeeding to embed sustainability in small businesses is having a sense of purpose. Small businesses do not have a lot of resources. There are few people running the show, and most of the time they're doing more than 3, 4, 5 different things, and then the roles are very, very diverse. So within that, to embed something like sustainability, the first thing you need to do is just sort of step back and look at the purpose. If it's purely profit, then what percentage of profit are you ready to sacrifice? Even if it is not 0.1% that you need to sacrifice for it, I think that's a good start. That is a very good start. So whilst we should think big, embed purpose in our businesses, but we should also start small and not wait for something mega to happen.
Okay, thank you for that, Ritik. And now all our guests will be joining us for the next section of today's show, which is we look at a couple of recent stories that have been in the press. And Matthew, I believe you spotted a piece in The Guardian looking at electric vehicles. Do electric cars really produce fewer car emissions than petrol or diesel vehicles? So Matthew, I know you're a big fan of electrification. Why are electric cars, why do they offer lower emissions?
Yeah, and this is a sort of a persistent one that often makes a lot of headlines. The car that you drive is often the second biggest purchase that you'll make in your life, really, apart from your house. So of course, people want to choose a car carefully, and if they want to buy an electric car for its low emissions credentials, of course, that they want to know that it's actually low emissions. But to summarize this in short, and there's you can go out and read scientific papers on this, which will run to hundreds of pages, analyzing all sorts of scenarios. But in very brief, in 30 seconds, electric cars are always going to be lower emissions than gasoline or petrol cars because, simply put, they're 3 times more efficient. So of the gasoline or petrol you put into a conventional car, only about 25% of the energy stored goes into moving the vehicle. Of the electricity that you put into an electric car, about 80 to 90% of that goes into moving the vehicle. It's just way more efficient. It uses 3 times less energy. And we've already heard that, of course, this electricity comes from the grid. And the grid today is a mix of coal-fired power stations, gas-fired, alongside renewables and a bit of nuclear. But of course, in the not so distant future, we're talking middle of next decade, the grid's going to be pretty much 100% decarbonized. And that's actually one of the easier actions of moving towards net zero. But even if we run the maths today, in simple terms, you think about a long-range electric car with a big battery. Building that vehicle, you're emitting actually an extra 3 tons of CO2 because of all the energy and mining that goes into making that battery. But even when you're charging on that grid today, which still has fossil fuels running that grid, you're still emitting 1 ton less CO2 by driving that electric car each year, because simply put, it's more efficient. So you have to own an electric car for about 3 years to pay back the extra carbon cost of producing it, or about 30,000 miles. And then after that, running it for the next 10, 15 years, then you're saving CO2. And that gets even more effective as the grid, of course, decarbonizes and we push more renewables onto it. And so I've done analysis on this in my days as an analyst at an investment bank. I did analysis on this for my book. I've worked with companies in my consulting business on decarbonization plans. And broadly speaking, switching from gas to electric vehicles is always a driver of low emissions. And very often there's also an economic case that it's going to be cheaper to run because EVs are more efficient, they use less energy, they require less maintenance, and they break down less often as well. So okay, I think it's a solid case for EVs.
Okay, so the equation then is 3 tons of carbon up front, but 1 ton a year less. So within 3 years, you're breaking even. Okay, Ram, Ritik, do you have any points to make on that question before we move on?
Nothing as of now.
Oh, I think, yeah, I think Matthew's touched upon that, and I think that the key to this is going to be more in the future. How the usage is expanded and how it is made available easier in a easier and a more affordable way. Also, some of the impact that we are seeing on the the battery industries and some of the storage side of the energy side is encouraging, because this is one of the first things that needs to change. And the first thing that comes to your mind whilst you're using an electric car is, how far would it go before I get to the next charging point? Now, that was the case even with petrol and diesel. So we just had these gas stations in place, and now we're a bit afraid of it. So I think it's a matter of getting on with it, and just hoping that the things get better from here on.
The analogy I always give, and I've got 2 electric cars, so both our vehicles that we own are electric, and it's more like you use your electric car more like you use a mobile phone. You run it on short trips every day, school runs, whatever it may be. You simply plug it in. It takes 5 seconds, and you charge it overnight. Give it a little top up, and you do that every couple of days. And for me, that's 99% of the use of that vehicle is easier than having to go every week or every 2 weeks to a petrol station. Long trips, yes, there's a little bit more planning, but actually in the UK now, I've driven the length of the UK in the car and regularly go up 6-7 hour drives up north. Never had an issue in terms of range. The biggest issue for me right now is the government rolling out proper charging for people who don't have off-road parking. So I have off-road parking. I know I've got my own charge cable when I get home. Super easy for me. But if you're going to buy an electric car and you don't know where you're parking, then there needs to be at least a slow charger on every lamppost, and plenty of sort of medium and fast charging options at shops and workplaces and things like that. So that's what's missing. But half of car owners in the UK have private parking, so there's still significant uptake to go before you start pushing on the harder to reach parts of the car market, I guess.
Okay, thank you for that, Matthew. And Ram, I think you're in India right now. Am I correct in saying that?
Yes, I'm based in India.
Yeah. How are electric vehicles doing in India? Is there much demand for them at the moment, or is it still very early stages?
So I would say we are much more early stages at this point. In fact, we still need people. I think what Ritik was also pointing out, right? The infrastructure we don't really have right now, where long drives you would never consider taking the electric car. So that is one thing. It's still early days, but I think in the next 5 to 10 years, there's a lot of initiatives by the government to promote EVs. So that is going to get ramped up in a big way. They also give a lot of subsidies when you buy an electric vehicle.
Are electric scooters quite commonplace?
Yes.
I was looking at the sort of battery swap stations for electric scooters.
Exactly,
are they quite common? Yeah.
Scooters are very common and more popular, and that's where
there's much lower cost up front and easy access. And yeah.
Also, in India, significantly smaller percentage own cars. So two-wheelers are the primary mode of transport for the majority of people in the country.
Makes sense that that's what the government wants to decarbonize first, is the easier option, the bigger market.
Okay, we've had a few questions from Nanish Gupta. Nanish has said 100% decarbonize. I'm assuming you're talking about the EU. I'm not quite sure what Nanish is referring to there. Did one of us talk about 100% decarbonized? I can't remember that.
So I was talking about the grid in the UK, and I think the goal is 2035, is it? Fully decarbonized grid in the UK. That's part of our net zero strategy.
All right. And then Nanish also says 100% decarbonisation of grid is not possible. Are you assuming that nuclear is renewable? So he's saying it's not possible, presumably, unless we've got nuclear. But I got a feeling you disagree with that, Matthew.
I would disagree with that, and I'm not anti-nuclear. So as part of the book, I reviewed all energy options. I'm anti-nuclear in the technology state that it is today. So large light water reactors is the current technology. There's a massive capital cost of building these things. You're talking like 20 billion dollars to build a massive facility. It requires government backing because it's such a huge risk for private investors. So it's got to be de-risked. So government has to get involved and guarantee prices. They're always late and they're always over budget. And simply, they're producing electricity which costs over 10 pence per kilowatt hour, when we can build wind farms for 5 pence per kilowatt hour in the UK and solar for 3, 4, 5 pence per kilowatt hour all over the world. So, nuclear is slow and ineffective in its current state. I don't mind the idea of small modular reactors, which are technology being looked at by the likes of Rolls-Royce, where you build the nuclear reactor in a factory and then you just ship it and assemble it on site. These are smaller, lower cost, less to go wrong, quicker, and can provide a stable sort of base load, if you like, for the grid, which is kind of how the grid works today. You have a stable base load and then you get ramping output through the day when we use more electricity. But it's also not necessary. It may be effective for some areas and some solutions, but certainly with a combination of some sort of battery technology, lithium ion is the most promising, coupled with things like pumped hydro, you can have ample short-term and sort of daily storage and long-term, so seasonal storage needs met, alongside some hydrogen, which would fit into the kind of a small part of the economy as well. And that will be your kind of storage for variable renewable output, which is wind and solar. It's not always sunny, it's not always windy, but with a combination of batteries, pumped hydro, and producing hydrogen, you can counterbalance that and keep a steady electricity supply through the year and through multiple years. And low wind, low sun periods.
So I don't want to turn this into a big debate about nuclear versus renewables.
Sorry, yeah. I'm going off on one there. Getting a bit technical for a what day is it? Wednesday morning.
I'm sure, Matthew, you're familiar, and I'm sure you're all familiar with Mark Jacobson, who's a professor at Harvard University, and he's done a lot of work on the idea of 100% renewables, and I think that he's answered a lot of those questions extremely well. But anyhow, we must move on. Ritik, you spotted an article, financial barriers to British SMEs sustainability. So what's all this about?
Yes, I think we touched upon it during the conversation today. It talks about what are the main barriers. Why are businesses not trying to be more sustainable? And well, it turns out to be that 78% prioritize it, and it's not that and it's in fact in more the SME segment, which is the small and medium enterprises, it is prioritized in a percentage terms in a bigger way than in the corporations, but in terms of the outcome of it, 57% of those small and medium enterprises find it difficult because of the financial challenges primarily and the costs. And they find it prohibitive. And one of the things that Dukes for You, has started doing it is not to impose this as a posh solution or something which is airy-fairy and as a bit requires costs first and then the outcomes. We've got to make it as a daily conversation. Start small and adding value and not adding more cost. And that is, I think, what puts all of us up, off in terms of running a small business. If somebody comes to you and say, hey, it's going to cost you money, and if you're in a situation such as this and you're not clear about what sort of an ROI or return on investment it is, so it's just purpose driven, etc. So I think what this article talks about essentially is about how the financial side of it is still a barrier, and I am personally witness to some meetings, some of these business people. I mean, Brighton's got a very thriving small business community, and they're very keen. They're eager. They're more eager than I wish some of the corporations would be as much. The other thing it touches upon is the support that is provided, and we've seen some backtracking recently. We've seen reprioritizations in terms of how the debt scenario is. You've got to always remember, to my earlier point, that whilst renewables and consumption of renewables has gone up, in terms of energy, it's also subsidized, and subsidies actually lead to the state debt. So which means the state becomes a bit poorer by subsidizing. So we are seeing some of those impacting the small businesses. And also, the disbursement of funds used to be from really councils, and now it's being a lot more centralized. Counties are going to manage it. So I guess all of those things, are barriers in terms of how things can be more local and more sustainable. So, but again, I think there's some positives, as we had mentioned earlier. So it definitely, what used to be the European Social Grant, is trying to be replaced by a much smaller, but at least there's a start, which is called the Social Prosperity Fund, etc. in many councils, many counties. So there are accesses. So it's just we have to have our chin on the grindstone and eyes on the horizon.
Okay, thank you for that, Ritik. All right. Okay, Joanna Masraf, who's actually been a guest on the show before, she talks about Jevons paradox, which states that in the long term, an increase in efficiency will generate an increase in resource consumption rather than a decrease. So we make things more efficient. And with the area we've saved, but instead of saving, all we people do is just consume more. And I suppose the classic example of that was with LED light. So it's a cheaper form of having lighting. So people respond by immediately having more lighting. Any thoughts about that comment?
Yeah, I think it's it is true, but the rebound's not 100%. So if you look at the studies on this, I forget the exact number, but I think it's if you save, you let's say 100% is the saving that you've made, it'll rebound about 20% in most studies across most use cases. And this comes back to something that some of the viewers may be familiar with. It's called the Kaya identity, which is a way to kind of quantify carbon emissions, which it says basically they're a function of how many people in the world, the consumption per person, the energy efficiency or energy use per unit of consumption, and the emissions per unit of energy. And so those are the kind of four levers that you have to control carbon emissions. Controlling populations, difficult and treacherous. Curbing consumption's never going to be popular for a politician. Energy efficiency is good, but things like the Jevons paradox tell us that it more buys time. It's never a complete solution, which is why I always come back to technology being the enabler of taking that energy use, that consumption, the emissions to zero, whilst still providing goods and services.
All right, so Joanne also asks, how do we reconcile our conversation to EVs with the need to reduce our overall use of electricity in order to regenerate the world? So we want to consume less electricity, but hey, we're having electric vehicles now. So is there a conflict there?
I mean, that comes back to the point that they use 3 times less energy than gas. It's just you're using electricity instead of gasoline, but you're using 3 times less of it. But yeah, broadly, as part of moving to net zero, we should the first piece of the puzzle that any transport minister or analyst should look at is how do we make more cities with better public transport, better for walking, better for cycling, better for trains and trams and buses, because these create community. They are good for our health and physical and mental health. So yeah, we shouldn't just be jumping straight to EVs.
All right. Okay. So one person is sort of said, well, why we, I mentioned just now we need to move on. I don't want to turn this into a discussion about renewables. And someone said, well, why can't we discuss it? It's an important point. And the answer to that question is because the theme of today's show is what steps an organisation can take to become more sustainable. And a lot of people are watching the show for that reason. So I didn't want to, but maybe if we have time at the end of today, we could return to that conversation, perhaps, depending on how you're all doing for time. But I would like to turn to our theme for today, which is the practical steps an organisation can take to become more sustainable. And while I've got all three of you here. Could you each give me a kind of a summary of your thoughts on that topic? A short summary. Try and keep your answers to a minute each. Ritik, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yes, sure. So thank you, Michael. So yes, this is something, again, I mean, I briefly talked about at the start. I think to begin with, we need to have a purpose. And that sometimes seems a bit airy-fairy, but it needs to be a more like a practical thing that, what are we in this business for? And I would be surprised if any business owner says we are not in it for profit. So I'm assuming, there would be that, percentage of the profit that gets allocated in various ways. We know that in small businesses, there's a very common way of, diagnosing a business and its objective. One is it a lifestyle business, which supports you and your family's lifestyle, or is it something that business which is for growth and for the future and for value? So value-based business, and this is David Miller quoted, but David Miller's quoted it from somewhere. Value-based businesses always have a purpose attached to it. And this is where I guess, there is a certain embedding of the purpose needs to be in terms of the business itself. I normally refer to a simple model, which is from the Lean Six Sigma methodology. Again, it's not very complex stuff, but very simple, which is you follow the SIPOC, which is supplier, input, process, output, and customer. Though it seems linear, it's actually cyclical. So, and you look at the various touch points and you see where and how you can make a difference without adding to your costs first. If it's one bulb less in terms of energy, or one more unit that you can save in terms of a bad packaging or a waste that you can avoid. Whether these are not new, by the way. It's just that our consumer and consumption habits and the market forces have taken us to an extreme point of where the spirit of lean is sort of submerged in the quest for profitability. So we got to look at the supply, which is the supply chain. We've got to look at the input in terms of some of the businesses and what inputs are. Look at the processes that we follow, and this is a pretty complex range of things. Then our output, which is the product itself, and then look at the customer and how they use the product, and then try and embed a tiny bit, not a massive amount, a tiny bit of the purpose into that somewhere and get a start. And it's a common thing that we can't do 50 push-ups. It's not that you don't do it, you just do 2 to start with. And then you get on with it. And then you repeat it and you just incrementally keep improving till it becomes a business habit. A business habit, as humans, we are creatures of habit. So it just becomes a business habit. It inculcates into what the business is essentially known as. Some of the businesses that we think of in today's world, which are sustainable, you think of those businesses and say, yeah, that's a business which actually lives up to it. And some of them don't, but yeah, I think this is where, and having that, so I'll just summarize in saying, having the purpose right at the top and then looking at the supply, input, process, output, customer thing, and then embed it somewhere and get a start, even if it's tiny.
And can you just remind us of those letters again? S something, you said S something.
SIPOC, SIPOC.
Could you do me a favor? Could you put that up in the comments section of
yes, sure,
and just say what it stands for? That'd be great. Ram, Richard was a bit naughty there because he went way over a minute. Ram, could you try to keep your answer to within?
Keep it very short.
Sure. What are your thoughts about a summary of how we can, the practical steps?
I think Ritik highlighted an important point. Most of the businesses, they're again thinking of profitability as their primary driver, right? So, and sustaining as a business entity. So the angle I would like to talk about here is how do we, businesses, their survival risk comes into play when, climate increases to 2 degrees, 3 degrees. Some of the businesses will be impacted by all of this. So helping, businesses think from that angle, right? How is this actually going to impact your own business? That perspective is very important for businesses to start looking at, who are already not looking at this. So that way they can look at the risks that they face and see what they can actually do to mitigate those risks. So that's an important element.
Okay, thank you for that, Ran. And Matthew, 1 minute, if at all possible, please.
1 minute. I could probably spend a week on this, couldn't we?
I know you can.
So, I mean, to be very, very practical from a climate change perspective, there's a ton of frameworks, standards, initiatives out there on sustainability and climate change. Last time I tried to count these things, I got up to 50 and I gave up because I forget all the alphabet soup of acronyms. And it's overwhelming, especially overwhelming, as Ritik mentioned, for sort of SMEs who don't have the capacity to sift through all of this stuff and the expertise and knowledge. But what I would flag as absolute best practice on the climate change side of things, 3 frameworks: greenhouse gas protocol. So this just tells you how to calculate the emissions of your company. Science-based targets. This is the go-to standard on how to set a target in terms of how quickly you should decarbonize in line with net zero and science. And thirdly, it's something called TCFD. So that's the climate-related task force on financial disclosure. It's a mouthful, but this is just a very good guide as to how to think about the risks and opportunities around climate change, how to manage them, how to report them to stakeholders like investors, customers, and employees. And I would say, especially, give me an extra 20 seconds, customers are going to be so important because, as let's say an SME, you're probably a supplier into a large customer. All of those large customers are being mandated to do scopes 1, 2, and 3 emissions. That means they even have to calculate the emissions of their value chain, i.e. you, the SME. And so they're going to want to know from you, what are your carbon emissions? How do you report them? How do you think about them? And that's going to become increasingly important as these companies work through all of those calculations over the coming years.
Okay, thank you for that, Matthew. Dawn Rennick has said something which I rather like. She says, great show. Thank you for that, Dawn. Always happy to get comments from people that say that. Love this discussion. Go vegan. Well, unfortunately, I'm not a vegan. I have to admit to that. But anyhow, John Brizorad said perhaps a show devoted to EVs would be helpful. And I think that's a great idea. I think that'd be very interesting to do. And I've got in mind a few guests that could be on that show, including you, Matthew. So that would perhaps be a good show. You could perhaps look at early spring, maybe.
Has to be a series, Michael.
A series, yes, indeed, yes. Well, I mean, we're kind of drifting away from ESG and more into AI, I think. But I think that electric vehicles would be very interesting. Dawn Renning again says, yes, embedded in a business model, a distinctive impact that only your organization can make. Impact business model, purpose and profit are both and or, not either or. So you should have both, not one or the other. Small and mid-size should join together in a collective and multiply the effect. Thank you for that, Dawn. Dawn is actually due to be appearing on the show later this month when we'll be discussing B Corps. So thank you for your comment, Dawn. I think what I'd like to do, if that's okay with you guys, is if you're still able to hang around, it'd be nice to talk about this sort of renewables, intermittency, 100% renewables discussion. But we need to press on with the core topic of today. And for that, I'd like to have a short chat with Ran. Apologies, we're going way over, but I hope that our audience can stick with us while we discuss these important issues. So this is just a short chat with me and Ram. And Ram, you are an advocate for environmental and ethical business practices. Can you talk about measurement, please?
Sure. So this is step one for any company to improve their sustainability practices, and frameworks are a very effective way of doing this. I think already Matthew had pointed out some of the relevant frameworks, and TCFD especially, for example, they recommend doing like a scenario analysis where, how would climate risk impact you when heat up by 1.5 degrees Celsius versus 2 versus 3. I think this is a very important way I think a business should do, where they measure how this would impact them, and so that way they can work towards an action plan that can help them mitigate these challenges they're likely to face in the future.
Okay, thank you for that. And so what frameworks can you use for assessing and setting impact sustainability goals?
I think Matthew had mentioned some of them. There's CDP, then there is GRI, also TCFD that we previously mentioned, that's actually merging with ISSP. So that's another relevant framework that companies can use. There are also other certifications. Once you have this high-level framework, depending on the industry you're in, I focus a lot more on consumer-facing brands. So whether they're in fashion or food or skincare, like in fashion, for example, if you make material like cotton, then there's GOTS. So we list a lot of these on our website, but these are the multiple different certifications you can also leverage that will also guide you depending on the specific element you're trying to improve on.
Okay, thank you. And when we talked the other day, we talked about a holistic approach. Can you expand upon that? What's all that about?
Sure. So generally, when we talk about sustainability, a lot more emphasis is given to the environment, like how it impacts the world around us. But we also should be factoring especially for consumer-facing products like say fashion or food, right? How it impacts the maker well-being or the animal welfare, right? And also like, is a company engaging in giving back to the community, right? These are also important parameters we should think about, and all of this will come in effect with the right governance and the right principles that the organization sets for itself.
Okay, and finally, you also talk about authentic communication. Can you expand upon that?
Sure. So as we rate a lot of brands on our site and help consumers choose more sustainable options, when we see a lot of brands, like let's say food brand, they speak about planting more trees instead of seeing how they're actually reducing the plastic usage. And I think it's very important for companies, especially for consumers who are particular about being more sustainable. They look at these parameters. So it's better to be authentic with consumers. That we've done ABC, and now we are looking to do these other initiatives that we have to make progress on. So I think that will actually build more trust with your consumers. So don't hesitate to point out areas that you're lacking in, and don't just try to divert the topic to something else. That is something. And I can also maybe share some links in the chat here of some of the brands that do a good job of trying to be more transparent about their sustainability practices.
Okay, thank you for that, Ram. Thank you. Well, Ram, if you could just join us again in a few minutes' time when we come to the end of the show on answering any more questions we've had from the audience and on a general discussion. Now I'm going to welcome back Ritik. Hi, Ritik. Good to have you back.
Thank you.
Ritik, your focus, I think, tends to be slightly more on small businesses. So, which I think is probably a little bit more challenging, I think it's one thing if you're a large organization and you've got specialists that deal with these things. But if you're a small business and you've got 1,001 things to worry about, how can a small business become more sustainable?
Yes, I think I've used up some of my words and time earlier in the previous response. But it applies to small businesses as well. In fact, it applies more to the small businesses, maybe not so much on the process complexity side of it, but definitely the supply chain and in product, and also the consumers and customers. And because you're not talking about huge market researches, it's very much local, and sometimes it's a very fixed set of customers that you revolve around. So and you grow that base. So I think a few things that comes to my mind straight away in terms of how can you be sustainable is a look at where you're paying anything for. So any costs that you're incurring, you need to look at it closely, whether that is first of all worth it. This is a financial viability, the financial sustainability, the sustainable finance side of it, and whether that you can continue to pay for that and keep adding value, or at least keep the value where it is. I mean, even if keeping the value where it is probably not suffices, right? And the second thing you need to look at is, if the product that you are selling out to the market, what kind of an impact it has. It goes back to, again, the purpose and impact based thing. And sometimes, as a small business owner, you've got more flexibility. Not sometimes, almost all the time, you've got the flexibility on decision making, because it's not consulting too many people. You're not going to a board for an approval. So you can make these small changes, which actually has an impact value, which is double or triple, which I sometimes use the severity and the occurrence framework, which is, how severe is it and what's the frequency of the occurrence. And if suppose you multiply that and that comes up to a big number, that is a big impact. So it is called the S&O reference, which is the severity severity and impact. When you do something like that as a small business, you don't need to sit down and have an elaborate chat and 5-6 hours of conversation. You would know it and you'd have it in the back of your mind. But it's also good to consult your partners and sometimes your accountant, and in terms of not just paying them for doing your financials, but also in terms of how they can help you find out some of these things that you might not be looking at every day. I also encourage a lot of small businesses to talk to your customers. Where are they going? Why are they buying your product? And what is it that you feature in terms of the viability of the product, and how do you feature in this? And there's been a very interesting study recently that, and I was reading that consumers have started switching to more sustainable products and trying to be sustainable. Now, not every consumer is actually able to make an impact through a business or the product because they don't own product, they're not business person, but they're trying to make their own impact through a small action of theirs, which is the purchase, the use, the disposal. And so if you can help with that, they feel that there is a gratifying aspect of it. Yes, I'm contributing, even if it is a small one. So I think the 3-pronged thing: look at your costs, identify each of those things that you're paying for, and how does it add up to the value of the product. And the second thing is obviously sit down and the other thing is, and when you look at the supply side of it, you've got to be global. Yes, you've got to act local, but you've got to think global, because we tend to think that if we fix it in our city, in our county, in our country, the issues will be sorted. It doesn't work that way, because a tiny problem like a Suez Canal block might impact a small business owner in a North Street in Brighton, because it doesn't get you the stuff that you're looking for. And they had probably factored in just as packaging, as a small thing as packaging, which is due to come in. Rest of it is all local. But that packaging is delayed because the ships are being held up. So we've got to be factoring in those. And be aware of the talk to your customers, consumers, and see how they relate to your product, and make those differences only which that matters to the businesses. And there are other things like I had spoken earlier about waste, how to certification extensively has been talked about. But again, small business owners, they're not very keen on going on big time certifications, because it's a lot of time and extra money. Look at best practices, and some of these are, I'm going to send out a link which has all these different support that the government provides, and how you can access them. For example, I didn't know that this was, and I still need to verify that there are support that is there's support provided to the boiler upgrade scheme, which is provides grants of upwards of 7,500, and there's a £350 per socket for the workplace charging scheme. So those things, I don't know how easily they're accessible, but these are some of the things that a small business can look at, because it adds up massively to the bottom line.
Okay, thanks for that, Ritik. I think time is pushing on. I'm hoping you can join us again in a few minutes while we can sum up some of the key issues. I think you've got a bit of sun in your eyes there, Ritik. I have a similar problem. I'm about 60 miles from you, and so we're obviously getting that same bit of sunshine shining in our faces. Indeed. So now Matthew is going to be joining us back on the show. Oops. Hello. Hello, Matthew.
I'm back.
Just quickly call up your profile. So, Matthew, I want to talk to you about these issues. If you could just bear with me for a moment whilst my computer wakes up. You say both big and small changes are required to reach net zero. So why is that then?
So I say that because it comes down to what we've been talking about today. You know, the questions coming in: renewables, electric cars, massive scale technological change, upending industry. You know, all of this, yes, it is required to reach net zero. Big actions do have to be taken. But also small actions, maybe you would say individual actions, are also equally important. And this comes back to, maybe we've come full circle here and I can talk about food again. So eating less meat or eliminating beef and lamb from our diets, you know, can have just as big an impact as switching to an electric vehicle or getting solar panels on your house, if not bigger. So, you know, as an individual change, it's a small change to make, but it has an outsized, massive impact. You know, and I was kind of skeptical of this before I sort of wrote book 1, book 2, but to give you, you know, an idea of the data on this. So agriculture's a quarter of all global emissions. It uses 1/3 of all the dry land on Earth. So compare that to the 2% of land which is used by cities and urban areas globally. And the continued expansion of agricultural land is what leads to deforestation and the associated carbon emissions. We've already cut down half of the forests on Earth, right? So if we continue eating as we do, we make no change to our food system, the population is going to grow a little bit more. We're all going to become more wealthy if the projections by the UN are correct. And when you're more wealthy, typically in the past, we've eaten more meat-rich diets. And if we continue to do all of those things, which are, you know, trending over the way they've been trending over the last few decades, then suddenly it's not 1/3 of all dry land on Earth that we need for agriculture. It's 2/3 of all dry land on Earth. And that's just not possible. But how do we prevent this from happening? Well, you know, population, that's kind of happening. Hopefully we are all getting more wealthy. That's great. But we can direct that wealth at better things. So instead of saying I have an extra, and this comes back to your comment earlier, maybe I've got $50 from my paycheck in my pocket, I'm going to go spend it on a steak dinner. Maybe we can think a little bit more wisely about the food choices that we're making. And this has an outsized impact, you know, because just choosing those different food choices, it can eliminate 70% of all agricultural emissions, nearly. So yes, we need technology change. Yes, we need cultural change. Yes, we need systems change and individual change. We require all of this. And you as business owners, whether it be a large company or a small company, then you need to maximize the opportunities that these trends create. You need to be aware of the risks that climate change poses to your business, and you need to support both governments and individuals in enacting these changes. So, for me, you know, it's big and small changes, and it's a triangle of the individual, companies, and governments pushing to achieve net zero.
Okay, all right, thank you for that. So I'm a bit sad about what you tell me about steak, because I do like my steak.
I still eat the odd steak, don't worry.
I'm allowed to have it.
It's moderation.
All right, okay. Maybe we could look forward to a future in which we have cultured meat and we can have steak grown from that way.
Well, that's another podcast entirely, but yeah,
indeed it is.
We need to get the price down.
We certainly do. But if it's exponential, if it follows an exponential curve, then maybe it will fall. Finally, have you got any case studies for employees and employers looking to create sustainable change in the workplace?
Yes, I mean, so I've done work with with companies looking at measuring and managing their emissions. So everything that we've talked about, from the greenhouse gas protocol, measuring the emissions, scopes 1 to 3, looking at targets, science-based targets, and wrapping that up into risk and opportunity and reporting and governance through TCFD. A couple that I wanted to pick out were, and I won't give the names, but these are roughly billion-dollar companies. One was an equipment manufacturer into the oil and gas industry. One was a sort of service-based IT company. And on the face of it, you would think, okay, if I had to pick one, the oil and gas supplier is going to be tricky, and the office-based IT company, that's going to be a breeze. It was actually the complete opposite. So we put working with the oil and gas supplier, created a great scope 1 to 3 inventory. It was complete, it was detailed, it covered all bases. Great decarbonisation plan in line with the speed of the decarbonisation that's required to reach net zero in time, and TCFD reporting it to all stakeholders. The IT company, which on the face of it should have been easier, actually proved more challenging. And the differences that I took away from the two is, in the oil and gas supply case, there was buy-in from everyone in all aspects of the building business. So the sustainability leads, the sales guys, the operations managers, and the senior management all the way up to the CEO, they were all on board with this. They were all taking part in the process, in calls, in emails. That's what you need. Secondly, they were organized, driven, and put together firm targets and KPIs for what they wanted from the process at different times along that process. And they stuck to them. And also they were under pressure from investors and from customers to take action because they wanted this information and this action within the business. So I think it's just something to think about within your company, whether it be small or big. If you want to create change, I would say that you need buy-in all the way from the shop floor to senior management. You need to make a business case or some sort of external pressure to drive that action, and then put clear targets, short, medium, longer term, where you want to be on your sustainability journey, and map it all out before you begin. And that way you're going to stay true to your original vision, and why you're doing this and when you want to get there.
Okay, thank you for that, Matthew. I think that it's probably time we sort of start drawing pretty close to an end, really. Matthew, incidentally, we've had a comment from someone that wants to book you as a speaker for an event, so I suggest you have a look through the comments and find that comment. Could I ask you all to give us I'm not even going to say a minute, I'm going to say 45 seconds, a 45-seconder of a take-home about practical steps an organisation can take to be more sustainable. It could be summarising what's discussed now, or just the key point. Ritik, could you kick that one off? 45 seconds?
Yes, since I have been focusing on supplier, small businesses, so I should just say SME, remember that, and S for the supply chain review, and this should be globally. Money about what it's being paid for, whether it adds to the purpose, and E would be the environmental impact, both for the local as well as the global community. So,
okay, right, thank you for that. And incidentally, Ritik earlier talked about SIPOC. That's actually up on the comments now. So if you go to the comments, you'll see that. Ram, 45 seconds. Thoughts, observations?
Starting off with where you are currently, and trying to assess the different risks that you stand to face in the next few years. Starting there, and then building a champion within your organization who can work with different departments to drive these initiatives, so that way you are actually able to mitigate and address these challenges that you stand to face. And I think, as I mentioned, some of the certifications and frameworks, you can leverage those to improve your own sustainability practices. And also, I think Don mentioned a question in the chat. B Corp certification is a very good one that you can use. It's a very systematic process of improving our practices.
Okay, thank you for answering Dawn's question there, Ram. Thank you for that. Matthew, can you give us a 45-seconder?
Yeah, so I mean, I would give you real practical steps on addressing climate change within an organization. First, measure your emissions, scope 1 and 2 for a small company, scopes 1, 2, and 3, which 3 is the value chain for a larger company. And then, the way that 99 out of 100 times, there's going to be 3 or 4 actions which will be the large part of your decarbonization journey. In the near term, it will be switch electricity provision to a 100% renewable tariff contract or self-generation. Short term, look for food ingredient choices if you're in the food industry or you have a canteen. Mid-term, electrify heating, electrify transport. So replace gas boilers with heat pumps, any combustion engines with electric vehicles. And then the rest are really things that a company should be doing anyway. Maintaining aircon so it doesn't leak harmful gases, minimize waste, improve efficiency, insulate. These are the sort of practical steps that I would recommend looking at if you want to start your decarbonization journey.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that, everybody. I just thought it'd be quite an idea, as we had a few questions earlier about the issue of renewables and the intermittency of renewables. Solar's no good when it's dark, wind's no good when it's not windy. What's the answer to that? I mean, I have a few thoughts myself, but I thought I would throw it at all of you as well. It seems to me that the cost of energy generated from wind and solar when in optimal conditions is now crazy cheap. It's so cheap that you can actually have more capacity than you would theoretically need. So you can have wind and solar generating electricity in suboptimal conditions, and you're still getting a reasonable amount of electricity. Wind and solar are largely complementary. It's often windy when it's not sunny. It's often sunny when it's not windy. So in that respect, by having both as opposed to relying on one, you can sort of overcome the problem of intermittency. I think there's another issue there, which is long distance transmission. If you have arrangements with other regions, maybe it could be 2,000 miles away, and it's unlikely, if it might not be windy or sunny where you are, but chances are it's sunny or windy within 2,000 miles of you. So there's an opportunity there. And then of course there's energy storage as well if all else fails. Seems to me that you can achieve this with existing technologies, but the one technology that we haven't really mastered yet is green hydrogen, which is probably something we will need to complete the transition. Comments? Do any of you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good summary of it, really. And there's lots of studies out there. And first of all, I would, does it have to be 100% wind and solar? No, it doesn't. There can be a mix of other things in the option, in the energy supply mix. And we're not going to know exactly how it's going to shake out until it happens. But really, the challenge of storing electricity, and remember, basically, we have to stop burning coal, oil, and gas. And to do that, we basically need to electrify everything in the economy and supply electricity from renewables. The focus of storing electricity, there's a problem which is short term and there's a problem which is seasonal. So there's an imbalance between summer and winter, and there's an imbalance between day and night. And then of course there's dark and still periods that you need to cover. So you have a range of technology options. On one end, it's batteries, which you'll cycle every day because they're expensive. You've got to get your money's worth out of them. And then at the other end, there's hydrogen, as you mentioned, Michael, which you can produce hydrogen from electricity. And you can do that when there's excess electricity going onto the grid or in a dedicated site. And that can be very cheaply stored in sort of underground caverns, built up, let's say, in summer when there's lots of solar, and used down and depleted in winter. That, of course, requires that there's use cases for it, but there will be use cases for hydrogen within industry such as fertilizer, manufacturing, green steel, and maybe certain aspects of very long-haul aviation and trucking.
Thank you for that, Matthew. Ritik, there is something else. I have forgotten to ask you a question from one of our, from somebody who asked a question on LinkedIn before the show. I don't want to be too disjointed, so maybe you could deal with what we're talking about now, and we'll come back to that right at the very end, if that's okay. But what are your thoughts about what Matthew and I have just been talking about the issue of renewables, 100% renewables, intermittency, etc.?
I think, again, I mean, with my background in risk, I tend to think of what are some of the risks with the way we are thinking is absolutely the right way of thinking, but we've got to make sure that we understand that this is the 1/7 or 1/8 of the population of the world thinking in this direction. And there are some who are thinking the opposite direction, and the rest of them are sitting in the middle. For a change to affect the planet, and by the way, I've said this in the first show, the planet doesn't need any saving. It's better off without us humans. But to make a change that is actually felt across the planet, it has to be global. So my number one caution is to take the world with whatever we're thinking and doing in terms of renewables. Factor in equity, factor in accesses, factor in all of those things that might be a barrier. Otherwise, the whole thing would come crashing down. We also got to look at the politics and the power equation. Some of these economies that we're talking about are hugely in political. Democracies play a role in it, and democracies, are fragile. And we don't want governments which are pro such views to actually come crashing down. It's just because there is another view that is espoused and is popular. So we've got to sort of balance it out, be patient, and see how it actually gets more and more participation, and bring in about, say, 7/8 of the population or 6/8 of the population. And those are two key things, inclusive in terms of the global awareness and inclusion. And the second thing is be very well aware of the PNP of it, which is the politics and the power.
All right.
I can give you, I think a great example of that is financing a solar farm for the last decade. If you wanted to build a solar farm in Germany, stable government, strong banks, good track record of build out on time or money, you can borrow money at a couple of percent. Maybe not at the moment, but certainly for the last decade. You compare that with trying to build a solar farm in Africa, and you're talking paying back 20% on the money that you borrow, which makes it infeasible or an unsustainably high price that you'd have to charge for that solar electricity. So I think to reiterate that point that Ritik's making is that what I believe is that countries that have the money and have the stability in the financial and political systems need to build this stuff out first, show it works, get the technology cost down, which is what we're doing, whilst countries still building and still developing stronger financial systems, stronger legal and governance systems, strengthen, they get that cost of capital down, that cost of borrowing down, then the technology is cheap, and then it becomes feasible to kind of leapfrog a fossil fuel grid and go directly into solar and wind. So I think it's a phased process, as you said, and that's one of the elements which is embedded within the COP process and the UNFCCC.
Okay, thank you for that. We did do an episode a few months ago, by the way, ESG and African perspective. If anyone's interested, they can have a look at that on our YouTube channel, or they can scroll through my LinkedIn page or the LinkedIn group, and they can find that episode. Because I don't know what percentage of the world live in India, but it's a pretty high percentage. It must be probably in excess of 10%, probably 14% of the world's population is India, I think. So Ram,
1.4 billion. It's closer to, I think, 18 to 20. I think maybe if suppose 7 billion is we have 1.4 billion, so it's about closer to like 20%, I would think.
20%. Okay. Well, I can't do the maths that quickly, but well done. Ram, what are your thoughts about this topic?
Sorry, your voice broke. About which topic?
Oh, the topic of renewables, 100% renewables, how we deal with the issue of intermittency. But I'm thinking in particular in the context of India, where I assume India gets a fair degree of sunshine. So I would imagine solar is a bit of an opportunity there. But what are your thoughts about rolling that out in India?
So, yeah, again, I've also worked in the solar and wind space. So the Indian government is, again, aggressively pushing for renewable energy. The challenge, to be completely moved to renewables is one, we need storage. That's a very important thing. Unless storage comes in, that is more affordable, we will not be able to like fully transition into just using renewables. That is one thing. The second aspect is also like energy density, right? That's another important thing to bring down costs. Now, actually, in India, coal and renewables, we are at price parity. So that's why there is massive movement towards renewables. In fact, India now is also like looking to making our own panels, reducing dependency on China. So that's another important thing to reduce any external risks. So these are the key things. So one, storage is the most important thing that for us to transition off oil and coal.
All right, thanks for that, Ram. Look, guys, we're going to have to close this show now. But apart from this, Ritik, you've got less than a minute to answer this question. But we did have a question from Deechash Naik. Considering your multi-decade experience in ESG consulting, how do companies benchmark their ESG performance against their peers and industry best practices? I ask this as there are many different frameworks and standards like TCFD or UK sustainability disclosure requirements and others. Do companies in the same sector follow the same standards to make benchmarking easier? Another query is how easy is it for stakeholders to agree on ESG matters depending on the project? I believe that multiple departments would be stakeholders, so it'd be imperative for all involved to be in agreement for all the project goals to be fulfilled. I look forward to your insights on this. Ritik, I don't think it's fair for me to ask you to answer that question in a minute. Would you mind responding to Jitash's question on the chat, but maybe give us a summary now? But we really have got to close the show in the next 30 to 60 seconds.
Well, yes, thanks to Jitesh for asking the question. The question is very relevant. Very quickly, I think standardization cuts both ways. So, if you establish a certain standard, you have to be unified, and that needs to be applied. I think we talked about a few certification accreditations today. So, those that have been mentioned by yourself, Jitesh. CDP is one of those investment standards, that is typically considered. Again, there are pros and cons to it. So, those are some of the things. The second query that you've asked, how easy, it is not easy at all. ESG matters, it's very difficult and often provides, drives wedges, and you just need to read up, just type in shareholder and ESG concerns to see where it is. And also look at, some of the big companies and their CDP ratings and climate ratings. It's very difficult because shareholders are looking for what's in it for them. And unless and until we embed the purpose in the product and its delivery and its service, etc., it's very difficult to solve for that problem.
Okay, thank you for that, Ritik. If you wouldn't mind, if you get an opportunity to go onto the group chat and have a chat with Jitesh about that, and I know you spotted his comment anyway. It'd be great if you could have a little bit of an interaction with that. But thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you for everyone at home watching, and see you all again next week. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Michael,
Great
see you, everyone.